Let's begin last night with that State of the Union. What is a no-fly zone supported by the United States and NATO on the table or off the table? The Ukrainians are desperate for it.
And first of all, thanks very much for having me on. I appreciate it. I've been listening to the whole newscast, and congratulations to you and the team. I think you've done an outstanding job covering what is really the #1 story, not only of the day, but the #1 story of the year. And that is Russia's illegal, unforgivable, abominable human rights violation in invading Ukraine. So I don't want to draw any lines in the sand here and say that a no-fly zone isn't going to happen. But as your coverage has made clear, the United States and Canada and the allies have aligned in an unprecedented way to deploy an unprecedented series of sanctions, humanitarian assistance, weapons assistance in attempting to defend Ukraine and push back on this Russian aggression. The one red line that Joe Biden articulated at the outset of this process, the one red line that Prime Minister Trudeau articulated, and the one red line that the entire ally community has articulated is that they are not going to engage in a troops on the ground strategy in Ukraine. Defending NATO is a different question. And the president said last night that the United States would defend every single inch of NATO territory if necessary to do so. But that does not extend to putting troops on the ground in Ukraine. And frankly, enforcing a no-fly zone over Ukraine is essentially putting troops on the ground, because the only way you enforce it is by putting airplanes in the sky that would take on Russian aircraft to enforce the no-fly zone. So I think everything is on the table to isolate Russia, to punish Russia, the Russian people, Vladimir Putin, his oligarch friends, to make them feel the pain of their actions, to cripple the Russian economy, to make Russia a pariah, and to use that assemblage of sanctions, which has never been deployed to this extent by this many countries in the world, to try and push him back from his illegal, aggressive, and deplorable conduct by invading Ukraine.
Ambassador Cohen, U.S. Ambassador to Canada. Article 5 is the core tenet of the NATO agreement. An attack on one is an attack on all. But in the world of hybrid warfare, what is an attack? Would the U.S. interpret a cyber attack on a NATO country from Russia? Would that be considered an act of war?
I feel like I'm in good company, since the media tried to get Joe Biden to bite on that question a week or so ago. He declined, and I think I'm going to decline. I think we'll know an attack when we see one. And I do think that the Joe Biden approach has been to apply measured sanctions based upon the extent of the Russian activity. And people may have been upset when those sanctions started, for example, with just covering a couple of territories that Vladimir Putin had moved in on. But as the Russian aggression grew, the sanctions were unleashed. And I don't think anyone today would say that the United States, Canada, or our allies is holding back from unleashing a full suite of sanctions designed to make Russia feel the pain of their deplorable and illegal actions.
The U.S. today confirmed that cluster munitions and vacuum bombs banned under the Geneva Convention have been used by Russia. I know the U.S. has been sending Stinger anti-aircraft weaponry and Javelin anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. So I appreciate that. But the Russians have a goal here. It's to decapitate the government and kill Zelensky, as you know. He's in Kyiv. How would the U.S. respond if the Russians killed the Ukrainian President Zelensky?
So I don't want to respond to it. I respect you and I respect the questions you're asking, but I don't want to respond to a series of hypothetical questions about if this happens, how would the United States respond? I mean, I will say, when you listen to the State of the Union address last night, when you listen to this, even that at the beginning of this segment, I couldn't be prouder and more satisfied of the fact that Joe Biden is the president of the United States and is leading the charge with the democracies in the world in building a coalition and making sure everyone is on the same page. He has done this with humility, allowing others to lead at times so that everyone has ownership over this approach. And for any activity by Russia that ratchets up their illegal, inhumane violations of human rights and international law, there will be reciprocal ramping up of sanctions and activities against Russia designed to injure the Russian economy, and again, specifically designed to get at Vladimir Putin and his oligarch friends.